so much for watching us on YouTube this morning.
Make sure you stay tuned because you're going to hear a message this morning that helps you know Jesus better.
But maybe give you a little bit of a recap as to where we're at here. We kicked off a series last week, and it's called Better Not Call Saul. And what we're doing is we're looking at the first king of Israel and his life, and he was a man named Saul. And he was a man for all intents and purposes, that he was the king that the people wanted, but he was not the king that they needed. And what we'll do as we look at his story, we're going to discover that to be true even as early as this morning. But before we get there, just looking back, it started. Saul's kingdom started last week with the request of the people to Samuel the prophet. The people of Israel, they go to Samuel the prophet and they say, Samuel, will you give us a king so that we can be like the other nations? God responds to that request by essentially saying, hey, your request is a complete rejection of me and my authority over their lives. But the people would not let go, they would not relent, and they were persistent in their request. And so what ends up happening is God begins this journey to bring Saul to his place as king of Israel. And what we're going to see is we're going to see that his way to the throne comes in one of the most unlikely ways. Even if you look at it and you look at this text and you consider it, honestly, like it feels almost just so many coincidental things happen. And so as I was thinking about that, I posted in our group on Facebook, the New Life Community Life group, and I said, does anyone have any examples of coincidences that happened in your life that you'd be willing to share that I may or may not use on Sunday morning? And we had 40 people comment, and so we had several. I can't use all 40 of them, or that would be all we would do. But these are a few that came that were just coincidences that as you zoom out, you can kind of see what God was doing here. This first one's from Natalia Lynn, and she said this. She said, I'm not sure if this is what you're looking for. It is. That's why we're using it. I'm not sure if this is what you're looking for. I joined Chi Alpha, a college ministry, because I thought it was a sorority without any dues. All the ladies said, amen! And I ended up getting saved through it during my sophomore year of college, and now I serve as a missionary with Chi Alpha Campus Ministries. That's pretty cool. All right, next one here. Jamie Popejoy. God intervened at the river. I just think that's a good sentence, right? Like God, I don't know, maybe that's a book or something or a movie. I don't know if I'd watch the movie, but God intervened at the river. I met a lady. 2 hours later, we were talking about healthcare and how I wanted to transition back to it. 2 weeks later, I was hired at Mercy. We both love sharing that story because we know it was God who brought us together in a little river in Galena that summer. We're known as river rats here. All right, I think this was from Bob Caldwell. He said this, a friend with an AG missions agency asked to meet with me to practice his new fundraising pitch. Like, my answer to those meetings are always no. like, oh yeah, I'd love to. Oh no, something just came up, I can't. But Bob did, and when he explained what Network 21 did in internet evangelism, I got so excited that I blew up his presentation by asking question after question. 3 weeks later, I was hired by them and filling out my paperwork to become a missionary. That had never been on my radar, and now I've been there for almost 8.5 years. This one's from Katie Erickson. She said, when I was 11 weeks pregnant with Joey, who's now 5, a nurse did an impromptu ultrasound just for fun. Like what? Who does that? Like, you know, it'd be fun, an ultrasound. But whatever. 2 weeks later, I was having surgery to remove what turned out to be ovarian cancer. Even another 2 weeks would have been too late to operate safely around the baby. Just so happened. This last one's funny. All right. Olivia Ryan. I went into Price Cutter to get brownie mix, and I got a husband. Yeah, you never know. I shop at Price Cutter too. I like what Sammy said. I guess I need to shop at Price Cutter more. And you just don't know. Like you look at, it's kind of funny, but we all have those moments in our lives, right, where we zoom out and it seemed coincidental, seemed like it wasn't that big of a thing. And then as we zoom out, we see that God was clearly doing something. And even like, I think of those stories, I think of stories like that in my life, and I just think, man, I'm so glad that this happened, because if this wouldn't have happened, then, well, that wouldn't have happened. And in the story we're going to look at this morning, I would say that if Saul was in the New Life Community Facebook group, like this is the story that he would tell. And you see it in 1 Samuel chapter 9, and we'll start in verse 1. Verse 1 really introduces us to him, but you'll see the point in verse 3. It says, there was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, son of Zeror, son of Bechereth, son of Aphiah, a Benjamite, a man of wealth. And he had a son whose name was Saul, a handsome young man. There was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. Don't you love it when you feel like the Bible's talking about you? From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people. Verse 3, this is when it kind of gets just almost coincidental. Now the donkeys of Kish, Saul's father, were lost. So Kish said to Saul his son, take one of the young men with you and arise. Go and look for the donkeys. Chapter 8. The people ask for a king. They say, we want a king like the other nations. Chapter 9, we meet the king, Saul. And what is the first thing that we see him do? We see him do something that kings don't do, which is look for donkeys. Because I can tell you this, that if you're a king, you're not looking for your donkeys. But here we meet him. His dad just so happens to lose his donkeys, and now Saul is in pursuit of donkeys. Now, what's interesting is that, as we'll see as we continue to look through the text, his pursuit of the donkeys leads him to the throne. But it started with him randomly pursuing donkeys that his father had lost. And before we kind of look at some of that stuff, I would introduce us to Saul. Now, Saul, the Israelites, they asked for a king like the other nations. And as we meet Saul, what the text shows us is that there is not a more fitting person to be the inevitable king of Israel. That in looking at these verses, actually a commentator said that if there was a Mr. Israel in the time, it would have been Saul. And you just see that in some of these details. That the first thing you see there is he's from the tribe of Benjamin. And if it's actually a very interesting political move to raise someone to the kingdom from the tribe of Benjamin, because it's not a prominent tribe. And the reason why that's so interesting is because if God would have picked someone from a more prominent tribe, then what would have happened was rivalry would have happened. There would have probably been a lot of fighting, and it would have inevitably resulted in civil war. But because Saul's from Benjamin and no one really cares, he's able to ascend to the throne pretty easily. Not only do you have that, but I mean, his name's Saul. Okay, the people asked for a king like the other nations. Saul's name, the name Saul, literally is translated asked for. That the king that they asked for was named asked for. So that happens, and then you just start looking at how it describes him. And it says that he was a handsome young man. And one of my favorite sports talk radio guys is Colin Cowherd, and he has this take where he thinks that if you think about the greatest athletes that you've seen, most of them are pretty good looking. And his take is that if you're good looking, you're just naturally more confident. I mean, think about it. Good looking person, they go to a party. People want to be around the good looking person. They laugh at all their jokes. They want to tell them stories. They want to impress them. That the better looking you are, that the more you kind of get away with because you're good looking. Some of you know what I'm talking about. You can just get away with more. And what Colin Cowherd says is he says, if that is your life, well, naturally, when you're put in a tough spot, you're going to be more confident. Because your life, all you've had are reasons to be confident. Whether the psychology on that is true or not, it doesn't really matter. The point is that Saul was handsome. And that he was the type of person that you would notice him and you think, oh man, he looks like a king. You even see that with the phrase young man, and young is probably not the best word there to use to describe him, that it could be better translated choice or prime. And what the author is saying, what the text is showing us, is that Saul, he was a guy who made a good impression. That he was the guy that when you saw him, you thought, oh man, that guy, he's got something going on. And if you go back to chapter 8 and you think about one of the things that the Israelites requested in their king, is they wanted a king who could help deliver them from their enemies. But that was a big reason. They were in a time of peace, and Samuel was getting older, and they thought, we don't want to fall back into being taken over. We need someone to protect us, which is why I think that God picked someone who it mentions was taller than any of the people. Saul is the only Israelite in all of Scripture whose height is mentioned. And usually in the Bible, when height is mentioned, it's actually talking about Israel's enemies. I mean, if you read anything about the Philistines, one of the things that you see very quickly is they were large people. And so what the text is showing us here is that this is the guy who's going to fight the Philistines. That he checks all the boxes externally for the type of king or the type of person that you would place as king. And his journey to the kingdom starts by looking for some donkeys. But what we're going to see is that as impressive as he is externally, he is as unimpressive internally. And we start seeing that here in verse 5. Let's take a look. It says, when they came to the land of Zuph, so they're looking for the donkeys. They're pursuing these donkeys that Saul's father lost. When they came to the land of Zuph, Saul said to his servant who was with him, come, let us go back, lest my father cease to care about the donkeys and become anxious about us. But he said to him, his servant said to him, behold, there is a man of God in this city, and he's a man who's held in honor, and all that he says comes true. So now let us go there. Perhaps he can tell us the way we should go. And then Saul said to his servant, but if we go, what can we bring him? For the bread in our sacks is gone, and there's no present to bring to the man of God. What do we have? And the servant answered Saul again, here I have with me 1/4 of a shekel of silver. I'll give it to the man of God, and he will tell us our way. Verse 9, formerly in Israel, when a man went to inquire of God, he would say, come, let's go to the seer, for today's prophet was formerly called a seer. And Saul said to his servant, well said, come, let us go. So they went to the city where the man of God was. Now, everything that's happening is subtle. But what's happening here is the author is showing us that, yeah, this guy checked a lot of external boxes. But the internal characteristics that it would take to lead Israel, he misses. But sure, he's the king that they would want. But he's not the one that they need. And you see that in a few just subtle things that are happening here in the text that I would draw to your attention. The first thing I would just draw to your attention is that his inability to care for the animals. Now, it doesn't seem like much. Like, I don't have an ability to care for animals. I told Servant my dog last week. Like, I'm not that guy. But if you think about Saul and his place in Israel's history, every prominent leader, for the most part, that has come up until this point in the history of Israel was a shepherd. Abraham was a shepherd. Isaac, shepherd. Jacob, shepherd. Joseph, shepherd. Even if you look at the book of 1 Samuel, one of the things that happens in 1 Samuel is that you've got the character Saul juxtaposed to the character of David. And when you talk about shepherds, like David, man, he cared for the sheep. There's a story about David where like a bear and a lion attack his sheep, and David just goes all like, I don't know, vigilante on them and destroys the bear and the dog, like to protect his sheep. And so you've got all these people who are really good at caring for animals who are leading Israel, and Saul can't even manage some large beasts. That what the author wants to see, that is unflattering to say the least. Not only do you have this happening, but if you look at the text and you consider what was happening, who's leading? Is it the king or is it the king's servant? Like what happens when Saul, like what's the first thing that Saul says? So, well, I guess we can't find the donkeys. I guess it's time to go home. I'd hate for my dad to get worried about me. But then his servant speaks up and says, you know what we should do? Let's go inquire of God. And then when they get to the seer, when they get to the person whom they could inquire, who pays? Is it the man who we met earlier who came from a wealthy family, or is it his servant who pays? That it's his servant. So what we're seeing here is we're seeing that this person, he's the king they wanted, but he's not the king they need. That he's checking the external boxes, but there are internal things that are happening with Saul that really are foreshadowing some of the failures that we're going to see once he is anointed king. But God, he's still working. And though he's got these issues, he's the one that they asked for. And you see God work more events to kind of set him up. Let's look at this here in verse 11 and 12. It says this: as they went up to the hill to the city, they met young women coming out to draw water and said to them, is the seer here? And they answered, he is. Behold, he's just ahead of you. Hurry. He has come just now to the city because the people have a sacrifice today on the high place. So they went up to the city, and as they were entering the city, they saw Samuel coming out toward them on his way up to the high place. Now, this is interesting. But Samuel didn't just stay in the same place. But the prophet Samuel, what he would do is he would travel around Israel on a circuit, and he would essentially like judge Israel, offer sacrifices so that people can connect with God. And he just so happens to be in the city that Saul's at. He just so happens to just go in the city at the same time that Saul is, whose dad just so happened to lose his donkeys about the time it would take for Saul to get to the city. There just so happens to be women out there drawing water who know exactly where the prophet is. That what's happening here is that God is orchestrating events. He's setting Saul's path, which is inevitably going to lead him to the throne. And we know this to be true because of what it says in the next few verses. Look at this in verse 15. Now, the day before Saul came, the Lord had revealed to Samuel. Samuel was the prophet. He was the one that they asked for a king. The Lord had revealed to Samuel, tomorrow about this time, I will send to you a man from the land of Benjamin, and you shall anoint him to be prince over my people Israel. He shall save my people from the hand of the Philistines. For when I have seen my people, because their cry has come to me. When Samuel saw Saul, the Lord told him, here is the man whom I spoke to you. It is he who shall restrain my people. That is so interesting. What's going on here? We go back to the last chapter. So in chapter 8, they ask for a king. God sets this guy on his donkey. God gives Samuel a vision the day before. And he says, tomorrow you're going to meet the guy. He's from Benjamin. But they asked for a king. The people came to Samuel before and they said, we would like a king. But do you notice what God's giving them? Not a king, he's giving them a prince. And what's happening here is God is saying, I'm not ready to let go of the mantle of authority over my people. That he's saying, you know what? I know what they're asking for. It's going to destroy them. They want a king. It's not the king of the... I'm going to continue to be in authority over them. Even though they're asking for all the wrong things, they want a king. I'm going to give them something close. I'm going to give them a prince. And you see like God's love for his people come out. I mean, think about it. Last chapter, they completely rejected the covenant that God made with him. They said, we no longer want to be your people. We would rather have a king we'd like to be his people. Like, think of how offensive, how frustrating, how humiliating that must have been for God. They completely pushed him aside. But what does God make very clear in this verse? That they are his people. That in the course of 2 verses, he says, they are my people 4 times. And this is the gospel. That you will frustrate him. You will do the opposite of what he asks for. You will ask him for things that will ruin you if he gives them to you. And yet, you're his. He loves you. He cares about you. That when he sees your sin, his response isn't, let's push them aside. His response to our sin is, I'm going to send them my son. And as God is holding on here and he's letting them see, like, this is happening. Again, there's another example as we continue to move forward in the text that Saul, he's not the guy. Look, verse 18. Then Saul approached Samuel in the gate and said to Samuel, tell me, where is the house of the seer? Samuel answered Saul, it's me. I am the seer. Go up before me to the high place, for today you shall eat with me. And in the morning I will let you go and tell you all that's on your mind. As for the donkeys that were lost 3 days ago, don't set your mind on them. They've been found. And for whom is all that is desirable in Israel? Is it not for you and your father's house? Saul answered, am I not a Benjamite? From the least of the tribes of Israel, and is not my clan the humblest of all the clans of the tribe of Benjamin? Why then have you spoken to me in this way? Now, 2 things happen here where you're like, so Saul definitely ends by showing some humility, which is good, but he also just keeps dinging himself. A few verses earlier, the women at the well, they told him that this is where Samuel is. They told, like, if you want to find Samuel, you go to this place. He goes to that place. He sees someone, and his question is, do you know where the seer is? Like, it just shows he's not that great at details. He's not paying attention. That he's not looking. But even more troubling is the fact that he's in the presence of Samuel, the great prophet in Israel, the one who helped the people of God meet with God. That Saul comes into his presence and has no idea who he is. That anyone in Israel who is committed to meeting with God and knowing him better, they would know who Samuel was if they were in his presence. But the fact that Saul doesn't shows that he has little regard for spiritual things. That he might look really impressive on the outside, but internally, he doesn't care. He doesn't care about God. He doesn't care about what God wants. Because if he did, he would know who Samuel was. So I think this is something that happened recently here at the church. And so it was in October probably. And we hadn't hired our kids pastor yet, Pastor Nathaniel. And so we were still kind of like, people knew we were looking. And there was someone locally who applied, who used to attend church here. They moved, and so they were far enough away from the church. There was too much of a drive, so they just went to church somewhere else. And but this person was interested in the position. And so he applied, but we told him, hey, we're not really looking. And so as the year started to wind down, I think he probably thought that we were going to reopen the search. And so this guy, he's like, he just so happens to show up in the office one day to just check in and see how we're doing, but really he was wanting to see what was going on with the hiring of our kids pastor. And so we're talking to him, and I'm out there and just kind of chatting him up, and he said something that I think he regrets. And so we're just talking, kind of, whatever. And he said, Ryan, just want you to know, I watch you guys every Sunday online. Now, here's my relationship with this guy. He's a liar. When he lies, he speaks his native tongue. And I know this because he used to go to church here. And he's here looking for a job. So I'm like, really? You watch us every week online. What did I talk about last Sunday? And okay, he's charming. He's charming. Like, he's a very charming. And so charming people can usually talk their way out of it. And so I asked that because usually people don't call, and his eyes get real big. And he starts, stammering and with your body language and you kind of start walking backwards. And he's like, you can't expect me to remember every detail of what you talked. You know what? Now that I think about it, I didn't watch last weekend. I missed how I was out. And I was like, okay, that's cool. I get that. Sometimes people get busy. I've been in the same series for 5 weeks. What's the title of the series? And he was like, and I was like, hey, good to see you. And I just walked in my office and that was it. Now, you might think, why would you tell that story when clearly people are watching you online? Because I know he's not watching it online. and it was just something he said. And here's what it says. He was just trying to get a job and he lied to the wrong person. That's fine. But I would just say, if he went to church here, he would know. He would know. You would know what the title of our series is if we've been in it for 5 weeks, if you go to church here. If you're paying attention, you would know. And the same is true that if you're interested in spiritual things and you're living in Israel during the time of Samuel, you come in the presence of Samuel, you know who Samuel is. And the fact that you don't, it says something about your spiritual health and your spiritual well-being. That Saul was the one that the people wanted, but he wasn't the one that the people needed. But still, you have God orchestrating events that bring him to a place that is very interesting. And you see that as the story closes here in verse 22. It says, then Samuel took Saul and his young man and brought them into the hall and gave them a place at the head of those who had been invited, who were about 30 people. And Samuel said to the cook, bring the portion I gave you, of which I said to you, put it aside. So the cook took up the leg and what was on it and set them before Saul. And Samuel said, see, what was kept is set before you. Eat, because it was kept for you until the hour appointed that you might eat with the guests. And so Saul ate with Samuel that day. 3 days earlier, his dad loses some donkeys. And his dad says, hey, why don't you go find them? 3 days later, he's having a meal with the most important person in all Israel. Not only is he having a meal with the most important person in all Israel, that person is showing everyone at that meal that Saul is the most important person at the table. He gives him the seat of honor. He gives him the best food. He's pointing them to see that this guy is the king that you asked for. And if I'm Saul, I'm sitting there at that table eating that leg thinking, man, I'm really glad I went looking for those donkeys. So the question is, okay, so what does this mean for us? And it means a few things. One is this, is that we need to constantly make it a priority to thank God because he's always working. That we need to thank God because he's always working. I imagine probably some of you in the room, you feel like you're chasing donkeys right now. You're frustrated with you're like, what am I doing? What is happening? Why? And I would just point out to you that Saul, his pursuit of donkeys led him to the throne. That you might be doing something right now, you might be going down some road and you are so unhappy, so frustrated, and you have no idea you have no idea how that's going to turn out for your good. When Saul started 3 days earlier running errands for his dad, you have no idea where God is taking you. But from this text, we just see God's always working. That his dad lost these donkeys and God spoke to Samuel and said, Saul is the one who you're going to anoint and you'll meet him tomorrow. And I hear that and I just, even as I read the stories of you guys and talking about God's worked in your life and it wasn't coincidental, but it was just like, man, I see what he was doing. And if you're like me, I hear those stories and it just feels so like, man, if you take a misstep, like almost scary, right? And I look at the story and I think, you know what? I think it's actually really hard to take a misstep. I'm not saying it's impossible, but what this story shows us is how difficult it is. I mean, consider Saul. Okay, what was the first thing that Saul said? Why don't we go home? Like that was the first thing he said. And there was a servant there who was like, no, let's just go ahead and go see Samuel. And then he's like, well, we don't have any money. He's like, you know what? I actually got a shekel in my bag. We can use that. That I think we're afraid we're going to misstep. And Saul wasn't even the right one. So just imagine if your heart's in the right place. That for us, if you're not where you want to be, it would be appropriate to respond to something like this by thanking God because he has an ability to always be working things behind the scenes. The Bible says that Jesus prays for us when we don't know how to pray for ourselves. That God's always working, so we can thank him for that. The other thing we see from this text, and it's foreshadowing, but it's coming, and it's that Saul, he didn't make spiritual development a priority. He will pay for it in the weeks to come. So for us, here's what we need to see. We need to see that it is on us to make spiritual development a priority. I mean, hear me. You aren't just going to wake up more godly. Like godliness is not something that comes upon you accidentally. But it's something where if you want to know Jesus better, you've got to be intentional in your pursuit. And the fact that you're watching online and you made a priority to turn this, I think that's important. The fact that you're here in this room and you said, I'm going to be, like that is something that's important. That should be part of your rhythm and your routine, but it's also important that you take time when it's just you and him. That you take time to know him better when there's not people around. This is one of the reasons why we're kicking off the year the way we are by doing church on Wednesday night. Last week, we talked about reading the Bible. We talked about just tips and tricks and ways you can do that more effectively. And this next week on Wednesday night, we're going to talk about prayer. We're going to talk spiritually about why you should pray, and then we're going to talk practically about ways that you can pray more effectively. Because here's what we know. We know that you're not just going to wake up all of a sudden and be like, I am more godly today. So for you, it's going to require a plan. So I would just ask you, if your goal this year is to know Jesus better, what are you doing to accomplish that goal? That what we will see in the weeks to come is Saul's lack of spiritual development will come back to bite him because you don't need it until you need it. But the thing that I can't shake as I close is that they didn't want him. In 1 Samuel 8, they didn't want God. They didn't want anything to do with him. They wanted a different king, a different ruler. And what does God do? He's like, I'm going to give him a prince because that's going to be a little bit better. And as much as they rejected me, as I've been there for them, I'm going to make sure that everybody knows that they are my people. There's people. He said 4 times in 2 verses because he didn't want them not to get the idea. And I imagine there's some of you here carrying guilt, shame, things that you've done that you would do differently, things that and you think, maybe like he's never going to be okay with me again. And I don't know that what you did was as bad as what they did. And that's an Old Testament story, but there's a New Testament reality that comes with it. And the New Testament reality comes in Romans chapter 5, verse 8. That on our worst, it says that God shows us his love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. You have no idea how much he loves you. And his love for you isn't contingent upon your behavior. That he died for you when you were a sinner. That on your worst day, his response wasn't, I'm going to push them aside. That his response was, on your worst day, I'm going to send my son to pay for the price for what they couldn't pay for themselves. That this is our hope. This is our reality. That as hard as we try, it is very difficult to push him away, but it should cause us to evaluate where we stand. Would you pray with me this morning? Heavenly Father, we come to you thankful for your goodness. God, thankful for your grace, thankful that we can look to you and that we can trust you. God, that we can call upon your name. We can know that you're working. And so God, I come to you this morning and I thank you that you are always working. Even when we don't see it, God, even when we're chasing donkeys, God, that you're still working your purposes out. Your word says that you work for the good of those who love you, who've been called according to your purpose. We trust you. We trust your ability to work on our behalf. And God, I just pray you'd help us to be spiritual. I pray that you'd help us to grow into the people that you've called us to be. Godliness does not happen by accident. And so God, I just pray that as we pursue you, that you would help us to know you better. And Jesus, we thank you for your love. Thank you for your great love for us that you show us. That while we were still sinners, Jesus died for us. God, if there's anyone here this morning who doesn't know him, doesn't know that to be true for them, I pray that by the power of your Spirit, that you'd make them aware of the reality and the beauty of the gospel. And that as they do, it would transform their hearts and their lives as they put their faith in him. And it's in his name we pray. Amen.
Thank you for watching us on YouTube today. We hope that the content that you heard helped you know Jesus better.
Also, don't forget to click subscribe and to click the bell icon so that you'll get notified every time our channel drops a new video.
If you would like to partner with us in what God is doing here at New Life, there are 3 ways that you can give.
You can give by mailing a check to the church. You can give by going to giving.nlspringfield.com, or you can text 84321 with the amount that you'd like to give.
And if you would like to connect with us in any other way, you can visit us at nlspringfield.com, click on the Connect tab, and we will get back to you as soon as we can.
See you next week.